Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Derek and continuing the series on the MiSTerFPGA DE-10 Nano project, and today we have one that you've all been asking for. I'm going to review not one but two of the QMTech clone MiSTerFPGA DE-10 boards. These are not made by Terasic, they are clone boards, and while they both function as a MiSTer, they both have some interesting qualifiers and changes that you're really going to have to think about whether or not you want to have them in your setup. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we have a Patreon link down below as well. But both of these QMTech boards are basically trying to clone the Terasic made DE-10 Nano, which has been the source board for the MiSTerFPGA project since its inception. And while I do want to let you know right off the top, these run all the cores and I was not able to trip them up in any way, shape, or form in that respect. They do have some strange hardware changes, and one of these boards I'm just going to say you probably don't want to have in your MiSTer setup, and I'm trying to be very unbiased here. I just want you guys to understand what these boards are. Now, the first clone with the double bank of GPIO pins is a very interesting and very strange setup. It really isn't compatible with any of the IO boards you're going to have on the market, so this is the type of thing that's going to be a very one-off custom build that is pretty far away from the Terasic made DE-10 Nano board. And as far as all of the IO boards you can pop on top, nothing really seems to want to fit this. The chip spacing is different. It's going to be one hell of a build to try to get anything in the existing ecosystem, even to have the fitment to be able to attempt to function. I was not able to get anything really to work on this board whatsoever, and that is because, again, the standard DE-10 Nano is going to have two banks of GPIO pins, one on top and one on the bottom, where the QMTech clone has three. So honestly, as far as this board is concerned, what I can tell you is you can get it running MiSTer cores, but outside of that, it's going to be a very odd ecosystem. This is one that I really don't recommend anybody pick up at this point in time. There's just too many changes to make it effective. But again, it does play everything I threw at it. I tried Saturn, I tried PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, Neo Geo arcade cores. It has no issues running the cores. It's just one of those things. The ecosystem for boards that you're going to want to put on the top and the bottom, the I/O, the USB hub, really isn't mature. And while I'm playing around with one of the Analog Pro boards from MiSTer add-ons, this really isn't meant to fit. It's more of a visual example because it's one of the loose boards I have right now, where none of the headers on the board are really going to line up with anything, whether you're on one of these boards, a board from a different maker, whether you're on a standard analog board. It just doesn't really seem to have the fitment to be able to go on top, and I really haven't seen whether or not QMTech is shipping anything. Now, moving over to the secondary and more popular at this point in time MiSTerFPGA clone board, you're going to see we now have a more standardized build where you have two sets of GPIO pins just like you would have on the Terasic made DE-10 Nano, and you're going to have your barrel jack for power, Ethernet, HDMI, USB ports, fan headers, all the things that you would expect. Now, they are going to be in some instances in slightly different places, but the real party trick is going to be the RAM on the bottom of the FPGA board in and of itself. This across two chips is 128 megabytes of RAM, the same that you would be putting on those GPIO pins if you were using a standard Terasic DE-10 board and then popping in either single or dual RAM. So these are on the bottom of the PCB versus something like what we're using today, where you have the RAM on these headers and you plug them into either one or both sockets on your DE-10 board, depending if you're trying to do a single RAM or a dual RAM build. And at this point in time, not really anything needs dual RAM, so honestly, single RAM is what I recommend 99 out of 100 people wanting to get into the ecosystem get. And it is a fun party trick. Having this RAM on the bottom of the board is going to improve things as far as how many GPIO pins you're going to have free, but there is a little bit of thing on this board with the included heatsink, and that is the amount of heat it's putting out, and I think that's down to having the RAM chips on the bottom of the board as well. This was measuring around 53C for me as far as the heat on the board is concerned. Now, that's within spec, but it is higher than your standard MiSTerFPGA build. Shouldn't really be a problem over time, but of course I can't review this over time. It is a new product. But again, as far as any of the IO boards are concerned, you can get a standard IO board to physically mate, but you do need to change some components and solder some things around to get full compatibility. And I'm assuming most people that want a cheap MiSTer build are not going to be grabbing their soldering iron and starting to change things around to try to get them to 100% work. Now, apparently QMTech is going to have an IO board for the top, but as of the recording of this video, I have not seen it. It is not for sale that I can tell. But again, as far as this board is concerned, it does run every MiSTerFPGA core I tried to use with it. So I want you to understand, if all you really care about is booting up cores at the cheapest possible value, you can do it with this board. Now, getting into the included fan and heatsink that comes with this is an area in which I really wouldn't use the included components whatsoever. I just do not think they are high enough quality that you would want to be dealing with them in the long term, and I'm really truly believing this cannot be a thermal pad whatsoever. It just has to be an adhesive sticker, because at its maximum thickness, with both pieces of paper protectant applied to both ends, it is only 0.33 millimeters in overall thickness. So we'll go ahead and apply that to the Cyclone V chip on the middle of the board, which is basically the brain of your MiSTerFPGA, the FPGA logic, as well as the ARM cores built in. And we'll go ahead and pop the heatsink on at the top. It is a very small fan, and while it is getting rid of enough heat and transferring it to be within spec for MiSTerFPGA and the Cyclone 5, I just really don't know if this is going to do the job over the long term. If you have this for a year or two, I would be slightly worried about heat, but you get to make your own determination in that. And again, on that sticker front, 0.17 millimeters of those two pieces of paper, leaving basically 0.16 millimeters of actual adhesive, so this cannot really be transferring any sort of thermal conductivity whatsoever, and if it is very minimal. Now, the one thing that if you do pick up a QMTech board, I would just basically treat like it's not in the box, has got to be the included power supply. This is definitely something that it feels in the hand like something that is not going to be good in the long term. Power is a very delicate and tricky thing. It is also a very dangerous thing. I cannot stress enough, you don't want to mess around with power. I am a filmmaker and cinematographer by trade. I work on sets, and I've also taught college students as far as film is concerned. One of the first things I talk about when I talk about electricity is it is not to be tampered with. It's not to be dismissed. You really do want to pay good attention to it. This power supply here is technically rated at 5 volts and 4 amps, but the amount of weight or lack thereof on the power supply really makes me think this is a very not quality part. It is an afterthought. The entire thing weighs exactly 114 grams, and sorry for the kitchen scale being a little dirty. It did have food on it right before I shot this. I was making myself some lunch. So as far as the included bits that come with this, the heat sink and fan are definitely cheap. The power supply, I would probably just put it in the recycling bin and not use it. But as far as inputting any control on this thing, you have your USB ports here, so that's going to be totally normalized. I did not test a MiSTer USB hub on this device because the fitment wasn't really getting at least close enough for me to actually be able to plug it in. So it's the type of thing, if you do want to grab this clone, you're probably just going to want to input your controls off the clone DE-10 board and not in other manners. At least that's my recommendation at the time of recording, because the fitment again on it was just slightly misaligned, and it was not anything that I was going to try to stress my own hardware to try to get this thing to plug in. But you can certainly use a USB hub, do whatever you want on the DE-10 clone board. You're going to be totally fine. But because these boards don't really have accessory boards for them yet, this is what your typical QM clone board setup is going to look like. I wouldn't use the power supply, do something different, but you're going to have the fan on top, some USB coming out of the side, and this will function as a MiSTerFPGA. It doesn't really need all that much to actually be a MiSTer. The USB hubs and the I/O boards honestly are just additions, and you see here that triple GPIO board as well. And like I said, this does function as a MiSTer. You can get direct video working out of the HDMI port. That was totally fine. So you can do stuff like getting analog video out as well. You're just going to probably have to have a powered adapter if you want to go HDMI to analog video on that said adapter, but it really depends on which one you own. But as far as this is concerned, kind of playing around with the QMTech clones, they're an interesting product. The triple header one I really don't recommend, and the standardized one with the 128 megabytes of RAM soldered on the bottom, it functions as a MiSTerFPGA. All of the cores load up, they do everything that you would expect them to. You just have to answer yourself the question, how much money do you want to save, and what sort of sacrifices do you want to make for that savings? That is a question you need to answer for yourself, but in the short-term tests, this clone with the built-in RAM functions as a MiSTer. If you plug the right things in, you'll be good to go. And of course, you could always just build a traditional MiSTer as well. If you have any questions, leave them down below, but we're done. Bye-bye.